The chamber was hushed, every shuffle of paper and every cough echoing against the marble walls. It had been another grinding session of speeches, accusations, and posturing until Elizabeth Warren leaned forward. There was a glint in her eyes that seasoned observers knew well. The look that meant she was about to say something no one would forget. "Let me be perfectly clear," she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. What Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett just delivered was not only a defense rooted in fact and courage, it was brilliance. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with a weight that no one could ignore. Reporters froze mid. Senators who had been scrolling on their phones suddenly looked up. Even those who had rolled their eyes at Crockett minutes earlier now found themselves listening, caught in the unexpected gravity of Warren's declaration. It wasn't routine praise. Warren's tone carried a rare conviction, the kind reserved for moments when history feels like it's tilting, when an older guard recognizes that a new voice has broken through the noise. Crockett, still seated, shifted slightly but said nothing. The look on her face revealed both surprise and restraint, as though she understood that acknowledgement from Warren was more than a compliment, it was a passing of the torch. And the room felt it. The oxygen shifted. Those accustomed to dismissing Crockett as a fiery newcomer suddenly found themselves forced to reconsider. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of expression. On social media, the clip would be replayed endlessly within hours. The caption always the same: Elizabeth Warren calls Jasmine Crockett brilliant. What made the moment so astonishing wasn't just the praise, it was the timing. Warren chose to speak in the middle of a storm, when Crockett had been under fire, when her opponents had sought to paint her as reckless and inexperienced. By stepping in then, Warren wasn't just applauding, she was rebuking those who doubted Crockett's place in the chamber. The shock was instant. Allies smiled, detractors bristled, and yet all were united in the same thought: something significant had just happened. But to understand why this moment sent shockwaves across America, we need to rewind. The Senate that day was not a calm arena of reasoned debate. It was a battlefield dressed in suits and procedure, a place where every word was sharpened to wound, and every pause calculated to diminish. The session had been called to confront pressing issues, but beneath the official agenda, another struggle simmered: who belonged in the chamber, and who did not. Jasmine Crockett, still relatively new to the national stage, carried the weight of that question on her shoulders. From the moment she took her seat, whispers followed her. Too fresh, too bold, too unwilling to play the quiet game expected of newcomers. In the eyes of the establishment, she was an upstart who hadn't yet earned the gravitas to challenge them. And so, from the beginning, she was met with subtle smirks, clipped interjections, and interruptions designed to shrink her presence. The dismissals came dressed in civility, yet the intent was clear. When Crockett began to present her points, voices would rise over hers, cutting her off with procedural corrections or pedantic diversions. Senators twice her age leaned back in their chairs with condescending smiles, treating her not as a peer, but as an intruder in their carefully guarded hierarchy. Some even muttered sarcastic asides, meant to undermine her confidence while projecting authority to the cameras. It wasn't just the chamber walls closing in. It was the culture of a political order that had always kept people like her at arm's length. A black woman, unafraid to speak plainly, unashamed of her roots, unwilling to soften her fire for the comfort of others. That defiance made her dangerous to the old guard. And in a chamber where power is measured in decades served and networks preserved, Crockett was meant to be a warning to anyone who thought fresh voices could break tradition's iron grip. But Crockett did not shrink. Each interruption only sharpened her focus. Each dismissal only steeled her resolve. She answered interruptions with clarity, parried dismissive smirks with sharper facts, and carried herself with the posture of someone who knew that her very presence was already a victory. Still, the imbalance was there. One woman against an orchestra of dismissive power. Elizabeth Warren watched, a veteran of countless battles. She had seen this play before: the establishment testing the newcomer, trying to press them back into silence. Warren, who herself had once been dismissed as a shrill outsider, recognized the pattern immediately. Yet even she seemed caught off guard by how Crockett handled the storm. The chamber continued its back and forth, the debate swelling with heat. Crockett's opponents believed they had her cornered, their interruptions stacking like bricks in a wall designed to contain her voice. What they hadn't realized was that their efforts to diminish her were building tension in the room. Tension that would soon snap in a moment no one could predict. The air was charged, like the seconds before a thunderclap. Each slight, each condescending interruption was kindling, and yet what was about to happen would flip the power dynamics on their head. Because before the praise came the fire. The Senate has always been more than a chamber of laws. It is a stage where egos perform, where titles are armor, and where power is protected with quiet ruthlessness. Against this backdrop, Jasmine Crockett was never meant to glide easily into acceptance. The antagonists who rose to challenge her were not always a single person, but rather a chorus of entrenched figures and aiders, pundits, and commentators who saw in her a disruption of the order they had spent their careers defending. These were the self-styled gatekeepers of tradition, men who had built reputations on polished arrogance, who spoke with the confidence of people who had never been told to wait their turn. They sneered at progress under the guise of procedure, cloaked elitism in words like decorum and experience. To them, Crockett was not a colleague. She was an intruder, trespassing on sacred ground. It began subtly, with the kind of dismissals that rarely make headlines but leave scars. During her earliest committee appearances, seasoned senators would wave off her points as inexperienced observations. They praised her energy with the tone one uses for a student rather than a peer, making it clear that she had not yet earned the right to be taken seriously. When she challenged outdated policies with sharp clarity, they responded not with counterarguments but with smirks, leaning back in their chairs as if indulging a child who didn't understand the game. The pundits amplified this condescension. Night after night, television panels mocked her delivery, branding her fiery speeches as unprofessional and too emotional. One conservative commentator sneered that Crockett was a headline hunter, not a policymaker, while another suggested her presence in the chamber was symbolic at best. Their words dripped with elitism. But beneath the surface was something uglier, the coded bigotry that had long been weaponized against women of color in politics. The attacks weren't always veiled. During one heated exchange, a senior senator interrupted her mid-sentence, declaring, "Young lady, you don't understand how this body works." The phrase lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't just disrespected, it was a dismissal of her legitimacy. A statement meant to reduce her from lawmaker to outsider in an instant. Clips of that moment went viral, dividing audiences. To her supporters, it was proof of the entrenched arrogance she was up against. To her detractors, it was confirmation of the hierarchy they wanted to preserve. Even beyond the chamber, efforts to silence her grew. Opinion writers framed her as a performer, rather than a legislator. Radio hosts scoffed that she was playing identity politics whenever she spoke about justice for marginalized communities. The narrative was clear. Crockett was not to be treated as an equal. She was to be contained, caricatured, and dismissed. And yet, for all their attempts, their disdain only revealed their fear, because underneath the arrogance was the recognition that Crockett's presence itself was revolutionary. Every time she spoke, she represented a voice the establishment had worked tirelessly to keep outside the marble walls. Every rebuttal she delivered threatened to pierce the armor of decades-old privilege. Elizabeth Warren had seen it before. Years earlier, she too had been dismissed as shrill, as unqualified, as a temporary flair in a chamber built for men. Watching Crockett face the same playbook was like seeing history repeat itself. But where Warren had carved her path with persistence and policy, Crockett's fire was raw, unpolished, and deeply resonant. It was the kind of voice that did not wait for permission to exist, it demanded to be heard. The villains in this story were not villains because of ideology alone, but because of the arrogance with which they wielded power. They did not simply disagree with Crockett, they sought to erase her significance, to remind her of her place, to draw invisible lines between who was worthy of leadership and who was not. Their smirks, their interruptions, their punditry, all carried the same message: you don't belong here, asterisk. But what they failed to see was that every attempt to dismiss her only strengthened the story she carried with her. The more they tried to push her to the margins, the clearer it became that she was standing at the center of something larger than herself. And in the middle of this storm, one woman carried a story that America needed to hear. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in marble halls or under the glow of Senate lights. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where justice often felt like a distant promise, and where the fight to be heard was not an abstract debate but a daily reality. Hers was a path carved not by privilege, but by persistence. She wasn't supposed to make it here, but she did. From an early age, Crockett carried a stubborn determination that set her apart. She saw injustice up close, not in textbooks but in lives unraveling around her. Families crushed under unfair housing policies, young men targeted by a system that presumed guilt, communities struggling without representation. These weren't case studies, they were her neighbors, her peers, her people. And rather than turning away, she leaned in, deciding early that her life would not be spent watching injustice pass unchecked. That decision carried her into the law. It wasn't glamour that drew her, but grit, the long hours, the relentless grind, the knowledge that someone had to stand in court for those who had no one else. She built her career not in the polished offices of corporate firms, but in crowded courtrooms, often underpaid and overworked, representing clients others overlooked. It was there, standing before judges who looked down at her over half-moon glasses, that she learned the cadence of resistance that she faced moments meant to break her. Senior attorneys questioned her competence not because of her arguments but because of who she was. Judges doubted her authority, mistaking her youth and her gender for inexperience. Yet time and again, she won not by shouting but by building cases so airtight they forced respect. Each victory carved another scar of resilience, each defeat another lesson in perseverance. But Crockett's story stretched beyond the courtroom. While many would have stopped at a stable legal career, she carried her fight into the streets, into grassroots rallies where voices rose not with legal jargon but with lived pain. She stood alongside single mothers fighting eviction, alongside students demanding fairness, alongside workers striking for dignity. It was in these rallies, megaphone in hand, her voice carried over chance that Crockett learned the power of speaking plainly, of cutting through political fog with words that rang true because they came from experience. Mentors emerged along the way, figures who saw in her not just ambition but authenticity. One veteran activist told her, "Your power isn't in sounding like them, your power is in sounding like you." She never forgot that. While others polished their edges to fit into the system, Crockett leaned into her own voice, raw and unapologetic. It came at a cost. Nights spent preparing cases bled into mornings at community meetings. Financial sacrifices piled up as she chose causes over comfort. Friends wondered why she carried battles that weren't her responsibility. But to Crockett, they were her responsibility, because she knew what it felt like to be dismissed, and she refused to let others bear that weight alone. When she first considered politics, many laughed. She wasn't cut from the cloth of carefully groomed candidates, wasn't packaged to fit the mold. But that, in truth, became her strength. Voters didn't see a politician rehearsed in talking points. They saw someone who had fought in the trenches of real life and never walked away. Campaign rallies for Crockett weren't sleek productions, they were gatherings of people hungry for someone who understood them. Her speeches were less about policy jargon and more about lived survival, and that honesty lit sparks wherever she went. Her election was not a quiet victory. It was a thunderclap. Against odds stacked high, against critics who sneered that she lacked the pedigree, she rose. And with her victory came a surge of expectation, hope, and scrutiny. She carried into office not just her own ambition but the weight of those who believed in her, those who had long been told that their voices didn't matter. This was the fire she brought into the Senate, a fire kindled in courtroom battles, fueled in rallies, tempered by sacrifice, and sharpened by dismissal. Her voice wasn't polished in think tanks, it was forged in lived struggle. Every scar she bore, every fight she carried, became part of the armor that would protect her when the chamber sought to break her. And it was precisely these battles that prepared her for the Senate moment that no one saw coming. The test of her voice was about to arrive. On the biggest stage of her life, the Senate chamber was already thick with tension when Jasmine Crockett rose to speak. The agenda had devolved into a familiar spectacle, voices clashing, accusations hurled, polished speeches carefully crafted to wound but never heal. Yet when Crockett took the floor, the temperature in the room shifted. She did not posture, she did not pause for approval. She came armed with sharp facts, unflinching in her delivery, her words carrying the unmistakable weight of someone who had lived what she was saying. "Let's stop pretending this debate is about procedure," she declared, her voice steady, eyes locked on her detractors. "This is about people's lives, and I won't stand silent while they are treated as collateral damage in a political game." The words cut through the chamber like a blade. A ripple moved across the room, some startled by her bluntness, others irritated that she refused to couch her truth in polite detours. She laid out statistics with precision, weaving them into stories of real families, real communities, stripping away the abstractions that lawmakers often use to hide behind. Every sentence seemed to hit harder than the last, and for the first time that day, the chamber quieted. But quiet never lasts when power feels threatened. One senator leaned back with a smirk and interrupted mid-sentence. "Congresswoman, perhaps you should familiarize yourself with the legislative process before making such sweeping claims." The words dripped with condescension. The chamber chuckled softly, allies exchanging knowing glances. It was the classic tactic: belittle, derail, dismiss. Crockett didn't flinch. Without raising her voice, she turned toward him and replied, "I'm quite familiar, Senator, familiar enough to know that hiding behind process is how injustice survives." The room stiffened, the smirk on his face faltered. If only for a second, another senator tried to pile on, muttering about rookie mistakes and overblown rhetoric. Crockett met it head-on, citing precedent, exposing contradictions, and dismantling their claims, piece by piece. Her words weren't just arguments, they were indictments of the arrogance that had long ruled the chamber. And with each rebuttal, the pressure mounted. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, sensing a story unfolding. Staffers exchanged whispers. Cameras zoomed in closer. The air was electric, charged with the anticipation of something breaking. Yet still, the attempts to silence her continued. A senator cut across her with procedural objections, trying to box her into silence. Another raised his voice over hers, as though volume alone could erase her point. Each time, Crockett steadied herself, refused to yield, and spoke louder, not in volume but in conviction. Her voice carried because it was not rehearsed, not manufactured, but rooted in lived truth. The tension was no longer subtle, it was visible. Some senators shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, drawn despite themselves. The establishment had tried to push her to the margins, but now she commanded the center. Every dismissal only heightened the drama. Every interruption only underscored her resolve. And yet, as powerful as her words were, the question lingered. Would anyone stand beside her? Could she hold the floor against a chorus determined to drown her out? The audience, both in the chamber and across the country watching later, leaned into that uncertainty. Crockett pressed on, her arguments now sharper, her tone unwavering. She was no longer just defending her point, she was defending her right to be heard. The battle had become symbolic, a newcomer's voice against the weight of tradition, truth against arrogance, dignity against dismissal. The silence that followed. Her final rebuttal was thick, almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that comes not from agreement but from shock that she had held her ground. Shock that she had not bent to their will. For a brief moment, the chamber was suspended in awe and disbelief. And then, something happened that left even her critics speechless. For a moment, the chamber held its breath. The interruptions had stopped, the condescension had gone quiet. And Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium like a storm gathering strength. Her eyes moved across the room, steady and unblinking, as if daring anyone to try and silence her again. The weight of every dismissal, every insult, every smirk hung in the air, and then, with a calmness that cut deeper than rage, she began her counterattack. "Let's be clear," Crockett said, pausing just long enough for the silence to stretch taut. "The American people did not send us here to play power games. They sent us here to solve problems. And if calling out hypocrisy makes me a target, then I'll wear that target proudly." Her words dropped like hammer blows, each one echoing louder than the last. She took the very arguments her opponents had hurled at her claims of inexperience, charges of recklessness, and dismantled them one by one. Where they had mocked her youth, she reminded them of the generations of young Americans who had always been the spark of progress. Where they had called her fiery, she reframed it as the fire of justice, the kind that had fueled every movement that ever bent America closer to its promise. Crockett leaned on facts, not fury, and her cadence was surgical. She quoted legal precedents, highlighted contradictions in her opponent's own statements, and tied every policy back to the people who would feel its impact most. It wasn't just debate, it was a masterclass in precision. Each pause she took was deliberate, each glance at her notes timed to let the silence carry the sting of her words further. The chamber was transfixed. Senators who had once lounged back casually now sat upright, their eyes fixed on the Congresswoman they had once dismissed as a novice. The reporters in the gallery scribbled faster, struggling to keep up with the cascade of quotes. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, as if pulled toward the gravity of the moment. And then came the line that stopped even her critics cold. "You tell me, I don't understand how this body works," Crockett said, her voice low but unshakable. "But maybe the real problem is that I understand it all too well. I see how it works for the powerful. I see how it silences the people who look like me, who come from where I come from, and I refuse to play that game." The chamber erupted not with sound, but with silence, the kind of silence that feels louder than any cheer. Senators glanced at one another, unsure of how to respond. Some looked down at their papers, as if hoping to escape the weight of what had just been said. Others sat frozen, their expressions betraying the rare realization that they had underestimated the wrong person. And then, from across the chamber, Elizabeth Warren leaned forward. She had been watching closely, her sharp eyes tracking every beat of Crockett's speech. For Warren, who had endured her own battles against dismissal and arrogance, the moment carried a resonance deeper than politics. She knew the courage it took to stand alone in that chamber, to hold one's ground against voices older, louder, and determined to drown you out. When Warren spoke, her voice sliced through the thick air with unmistakable conviction. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her Boston cadence deliberate, measured, but ringing with sincerity. "What Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has done here today is more than stand her ground. What she has done is deliver brilliance, absolute brilliance. And if this body is too blind to see it, then history will not be." The chamber froze. These were not casual words of collegial encouragement. This was Elizabeth Warren, the seasoned fighter, the voice of progressivism, the senator whose reputation was built on sharp intellect and relentless tenacity, pausing to validate Crockett, not as a junior lawmaker, not as a novelty, but as an equal force. For Warren to say it aloud, with that kind of weight, was monumental. The impact was instant. Some senators shifted uneasily, their faces betraying discomfort at having their dismissals rebuked so publicly. Others leaned in, caught off guard by Warren's forceful recognition. Staffers in the gallery exchanged wide-eyed looks, and Crockett herself, though visibly holding her composure, could not hide the flicker of emotion that crossed her face, a mix of pride, gratitude, and disbelief. But it wasn't just praise. It was something more intimate, more profound. It was a seasoned warrior extending her hand to a rising fighter, signaling not only respect but a quiet transfer of legacy. In that moment, the distance between generations collapsed, and the chamber bore witness to a rare moment of solidarity that transcended party lines and political theater. The cameras caught everything. Warren's eyes steady, her voice firm. Crockett's stillness, the subtle lift of her chin, as if absorbing the validation without letting it overwhelm her. The stunned faces of those who had once scoffed. Social media would later replay the clip, endlessly, dissecting Warren's tone, Crockett's reaction, and the silence that followed. Commentators would argue whether it was the moment Crockett cemented her place in the national conversation. But for those who were in the chamber, no analysis was necessary. They felt it. The shift in the room, the sense that history had just brushed past them. For Crockett, the acknowledgement was more than personal validation, it was a public coronation. Every insult she had endured, every dismissal she had weathered, every smirk she had parried, they all collapsed under the weight of Warren's words. To be called brilliant in that chamber, and by Elizabeth Warren, of all people, was to be elevated beyond doubt. And yet the brilliance wasn't in Warren's praise alone, it was in Crockett's refusal to bend. Her insistence on standing tall until even her detractors could no longer deny her. Warren had not given Crockett her power. She had simply named aloud what the room, and the country, had just witnessed with their own eyes. The chamber seemed suspended in that realization. The echoes of Warren's words settling into the marble, like an inscription that could not be erased. And in that silence, one truth became undeniable. Something had shifted. A torch had been passed, not in ceremony but in struggle. Not with pomp but with raw honesty. But the chamber wasn't the only place that erupted. The moment Elizabeth Warren's words landed, the chamber fell silent. But outside those marble walls, the silence didn't last long. Within minutes, the sound of keyboards clicking and phones buzzing became the thunder that carried Crockett's name across America. On Twitter, the first clip surfaced barely 60 seconds after Warren's acknowledgement. A grainy C-SPAN feed, shaky from someone filming their TV, captioned with 6 simple words, "Jasmine Crockett just shut it down." By the time the clip reached 5,000 views, someone had added Warren's line, "Absolute brilliance," in bold white subtitles. By 50,000 views, the clip was no longer grainy. News outlets were cutting crisp versions, and the were already climbing. Hashtag Crockett Brilliance. Hashtag Warren said it. Hashtag Passatorch. Scrolling the feeds felt like watching a digital wildfire spread. One post showed Crockett at the podium, frozen mid-sentence, overlaid with the caption, "She wasn't supposed to be here. But she is, and she's making history." Another user cut Crockett's fiery takedown into a TikTok edit bass drops, and jump cuts timed to her sharpest lines that racked up 1 million views before sunrise. On Instagram, activists reposted the clip with long captions about representation, resilience, and the breaking of barriers. But it wasn't just activists and everyday users. Blue-check celebrities joined the chorus. An Academy Award actress tweeted, "I've been waiting my whole life to hear a woman speak like that in the Senate. Jasmine Crockett, we see you." A Grammy-winning musician posted a story with Crockett's photo and a single word, "Queen." Athletes stitched together highlights of Crockett's speech with footage of their own victories, drawing parallels between sports and politics. Late-night hosts turned the exchange into their opening monologues. Clips circulated of comedians, mimicking the stunned faces of Crockett's opponents, then cutting to Warren's slow, deliberate praise. The laughter carried an edge of vindication. America had seen who tried to dismiss Crockett, and now they were watching her rise. Meanwhile, grassroots organizers seized the moment. Local advocacy groups shared the clip alongside calls to action, voter registration links, donation portals, petitions for justice. The hashtags weren't just digital noise, they became rallying cries. Hashtag Crockett Brilliance wasn't trending just as a meme, it was trending as a movement. Commentators on YouTube uploaded hour-long breakdowns of the speech. One political analyst leaned forward on camera and said, almost in disbelief, "We just witnessed a generational shift." Mark this day. Another video, titled "Why Elizabeth Warren's Praise Changed Everything," climbed to the top of trending political content within hours. But perhaps the most striking wave came from the people who had never before seen themselves reflected in the halls of power. Young women of color filmed reaction videos, tears streaming as they repeated Crockett's words about refusing to be silenced. Parents shared clips with their children, narrating, "This is what strength looks like, this is what representation means." The memes poured in, too. A freeze frame of Crockett pointing at her notes became the caption for "When you've done the homework and the teacher calls on you." Warren, leaning forward with that approving look, turned into "When your boss finally recognizes your genius." What had started as political theater had spilled into popular culture, woven into the humor, pride, and validation of millions. And while Crockett's detractors scrambled to spin the moment, their efforts barely registered against the tidal wave of praise. Attempts at dismissing her as emotional or grandstanding were drowned out by the sheer volume of voices celebrating her command. For every pundit rolling their eyes, there were tens of thousands amplifying Warren's words, "Absolute brilliance." By midnight, major networks had pushed the clip into primetime coverage. Kyron's read, Crockett's Senate moment goes viral and Warren praises rising star. Panelists debated what it meant for the future of the Democratic Party. But, in living rooms across the country, families weren't waiting for analysis. They were replaying the clip themselves, watching Crockett refuse to bend, watching Warren acknowledge it, and feeling something shift. The echo wasn't just digital. In neighborhoods across the nation, community centers played the clip on loop. During gatherings, teachers brought it up in classrooms as an example of courage in civic life. Churches folded it into sermons about justice. The ripples stretched further than Washington, faster than anyone inside that chamber could have imagined. And through it all, one truth kept reverberating. This wasn't just about a single speech, or a single line of praise. It was about what it represented. A newcomer facing the storm, standing tall, and being seen. A torch carried by one woman, passed if only symbolically to another, and a country watching, reminded that brilliance can come from the very voices once dismissed. But the true power of this moment was not just in the praise, but in the lesson it left behind. Elizabeth Warren's praise did more than commend Jasmine Crockett's sharp arguments. It transformed into something larger, a declaration that truth, brilliance, and resilience will always find a way to cut through the noise, no matter how loud the opposition. In that chamber, where arrogance often masquerades as authority, one woman's brilliance forced the room to pause. And when Warren named it, she was not just honoring Crockett. She was affirming that voices once ignored, dismissed, or mocked could no longer be silenced. This moment echoed far beyond Crockett herself. It became a symbol of what women in politics have endured for generations. Being underestimated, spoken over, patronized, or told to wait their turn. Yet time and again, history proves that those very women, whether standing in courtrooms, marching in streets, or rising on the Senate floor, become the ones who redefine what power sounds like. Crockett's moment was not just hers. It was part of a lineage of resilience. Warren's words crystallized the moral clarity at the heart of the exchange. Dignity triumphs over arrogance. Brilliance rises above bias. And when the establishment tries to cage truth with rules, interruptions, or ridicule, truth will always slip through the cracks, reshaping the ground beneath their feet. For progressive Americans watching, the lesson was deeply personal. It was proof that their struggle for equity, justice, and representation was not futile. It was alive, visible, undeniable. This was more than a Senate debate. It was a mirror held up to the country. Crockett's poise under pressure reflected every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong. Every young activist who had been told their ideas were too radical. Every working mother dismissed by men who assumed she was too busy to lead. And Warren's praise was not simply political, it was validation. It said to each of them, "We see you, we honor your brilliance, and we will not let it be erased." The beauty of that moment was in its universality. It wasn't only about women in politics, but about the underestimated everywhere. It carried a truth that transcended party lines. When brilliance meets resilience, no wall of arrogance can contain it. Crockett's words became a beacon for anyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, reminding them that the power of dignity is louder than the cruelty of dismissal. And perhaps that was the real lesson. The Senate floor may have been the stage, but the story belonged to everyone who saw themselves in Crockett's rise. It was about the courage to speak truth to power, even when the odds are stacked high. It was about the ability to carry yourself with grace while others tried to break you down. It was about the certainty that history does not belong to the loudest voices in the room, but to the most unyielding. For Warren, a seasoned voice of progressivism, to pause and call Crockett's brilliance by name was not simply a moment of mentorship, it was a reminder of what democracy is supposed to look like. A chorus of voices, not a monologue of the privileged. A passing of the torch, not a gatekeeping of the flame. And so the moral clarity stands. Brilliance, when anchored in truth and dignity, cannot be contained by arrogance or drowned out by bias. It will rise, it will echo, and it will inspire. The viral clips, the trending hashtags, the late-night jokestos were ripples. But the deeper current was a lesson etched into the American story. Underestimated voices are not just surviving in the halls of power. They are beginning to lead them, because this isn't just a Senate story. It's a story about us. Elizabeth Warren's words will be remembered not just as a moment of Senate praise, but as an affirmation that brilliance, when it rises from resilience, cannot be ignored. She looked across that chamber and, with rare sincerity, acknowledged Jasmine Crockett as brilliance personified. In that instant, Crockett wasn't just another senator. She became the embodiment of a new era of leadership, one forged not in privilege but in perseverance. Her story is a reminder that the underestimated can rise, that the silenced can roar, and that when courage meets conviction, the old rules of power no longer apply. Crockett stood tall in the face of dismissal, and Warren's acknowledgement was not only a gesture of respect, it was a signal to the nation that voices like hers are the future. This is why the moment matters. It's bigger than the chamber itself. It's about the country we want to build, one where brilliance is not stifled by arrogance, and where resilience is not punished but celebrated. Crockett's rise is proof that our democracy grows stronger when new voices break through, when truth shakes the walls, and when women of courage refuse to be silenced. And now, it's on us. If you believe in voices like Jasmine Crockett said, you believe her story deserves to echo beyond those Senate walls, then share this. Tell it, spread it, let others feel the power of that moment. Subscribe, stand tall, and be part of this movement that insists brilliance belongs at the center of power, not at its margins. Because this story doesn't end here. It continues every time we amplify voices like Crockett's and every time we choose to let truth, dignity, and resilience lead the way.